So today our goal is to replace the TCC solenoid in this 1988 Pontiac Fiero Formula V6. It's obviously got an automatic transmission, otherwise we wouldn't need to replace the TCC solenoid. So a little bit of background here. The symptom for this problem is when you get the car above 45 miles per hour, the 3-speed automatic transmission in this vehicle will lock up, and that transmission lockup is to get you about 2 or 3 extra miles per gallon. And it's supposed to disengage as you come down in speed. Now if it doesn't disengage, what happens is as you slow down and come to a stop, of course the motor is connected to the transmission and they're locked together. Therefore, if the wheels stop, the transmission stops and it will stall your motor. Now if you never get it above 45 miles an hour, this symptom won't come up. So if you want to limp home with this, you can just keep it under 45 miles an hour. And there's also another way to limp home. You can actually disconnect the TCC solenoid connector on top of the transmission, and I can show you that later in the video. So today, that's what our goal is. My background is I was a GMI student working at Oldsmobile, and it just so happens that the Olds garage at the GM Proving Grounds was right next door to the Pontiac garage. So I got to see the Fiero as it was going from prototype to production, and this of course is the last year of the Fiero, the 88, where they made a bunch of modifications. And actually Oldsmobile division built a lot of the subcomponents for the Fiero, including some of the rim parts on the body panels, as well as the gas tank and other things that were shipped from Lansing to Pontiac. So in any case, let's get started. I'll show you the components as well as the tools that you need. And today I have my assistant Terra here to help us out as we go through it. So here on the bench I have the three main components that we need from GM. I've got them flipped over here, and I do have the part numbers in the description to this video so you can take a look at it. So the first component is this third gear pressure switch, and its part number is 8643710. This is an OEM part right here from GM. Also have a gasket for the transmission that we have to open up, and that gasket is part number 8678169. And finally, the actual TCC solenoid itself, it comes with a wiring harness and a clip. That TCC solenoid AC Delco part OEM 8689901. So we're ready to do this job, and now to go through the tools, I wanted to quickly take a look at the PDM, which is what we called it in the GM days, but the service manual for the 88 Fiero. So I've highlighted a couple pages to take a look at here. And so if we look at this first page, it actually shows a nice diagram of the transmission, and this is the case that we're going to take off. They actually call it the transaxle side case cover. And if you actually look, there is a procedure here on how to take it off, but what's interesting is that it says that you need to raise the vehicle and also loosen the motor mounts to get that case off, which is really, I don't think, necessary to do that. But I just thought it was interesting. That's what the PDM says to do, to take it off. The other page I want to take a look at real quick here is the diagram page, and here it shows actually the case cover off and what we're going to do. Here is the actual TCC solenoid. There's a bolt that goes underneath it there, going vertically up to hold it in. Here's what they call the third gear pressure switch, and the wires come up this way and then behind this little shifter linkage and then out through this connector, which goes to the ECM. And so this is what it looks like with the cover off. We'll take a look at that when we take the cover off as well to verify that. So another page that I thought was interesting is the TCC solenoid discussion here on how to diagnose a bad solenoid. Well, we really don't have to diagnose it because we know it's bad based on the behavior of the car. And finally, this last page shows kind of a blow-up diagram of the cover removed, and you can take a look at the wiring. Actually, it's right here. This is the wiring for the TCC solenoid third gear switch and the connector here that goes out through the case. And here's the case that we're going to have to take off, and then the gasket and has to drop down when the car is jacked up with the wheel off. So now let's take a look at the tools that we need. First of all, you're going to need this 19 millimeter socket to get the wheel off. Once the wheel's off, you'll need a Phillips head screwdriver and maybe one of these little tools to take off those little plastic connectors to get the splash guard off. So the splash guard comes off. You might also need a 7 millimeter socket to get some of the small machine screws that hold on the splash guard as well. So it's got screws as well as those little plastic retainers, and that's what this is for. If you don't have one of these, you can use a flathead screwdriver. So I have a flathead screwdriver as well. So that was needed to take the intake I guess cowl off. So you need to take that between the air cleaner and the throttle body. Then I had a bunch of different extensions for my 3/8 inch 13 millimeter socket here, which is what's needed to take the 11 bolts around the transmission cover off. I have a wobble extension, a regular extension, a long extension, and this adapter for my DeWalt that I used to get those bolts off. You don't need to do any of that. If you just have a regular 3/8 inch ratchet, that'll work. I just tried to use what I had. The 3/8 inch ratchet actually comes in handy because 4 out of the 11 bolts, I think, or 4 or 5 actually, out of the 11 bolts are only accessible from the trunk side. So you got to get in the trunk and reach down from above to get those 4 or 5 bolts, and then the rest of them are taken from where the wheel well has given you access. Alright, so once you get the cover off, you're going to need to take the TCC solenoid out, and you need a T30 hex, or sorry, T30 Torx, socket like this, or maybe just an Allen type kind of wrench with a T30 on the end of it to get that off. To take the third gear pressure switch off, I used a 26 millimeter wrench, this manual wrench here. You don't need to have this. I just happen to have a 26 which fits right over the top of it. You can use a pair of channel locks or open-ended plier type kind of thing to get it off, but this is a clean way to do it so you don't strip it or damage it in any way. It fits perfectly over it. So once the cover is off and you have it out, you want to clean it up using some brake cleaner, and also to scrape off any of the excess gasket that's left over. I used this little scraper and this little razor edge thingy, as well as this scraper. So that's really it as far as tools. Once you scrape it off and get the new gasket on, you can then go backwards through this process to put all the things back together, and that's hopefully what this video is going to be all about. So the first step in this process, of course, is to jack the car up and to take the wheel off here on the driver's side. And so the goal here is to get through all the splash guards to get to the transmission. And so what we have to do next is take off all these splash guards. It's a good chance to clean them up too, so if you haven't had those off in a while, this would be a good time to do that. So kind of the basic procedure for this is to use a Phillips head and maybe a couple hex sockets to get off all these different splash guards to get to the transmission. The transmission's right behind this one right here, pretty much. And so that's going to be the next step, and we'll get to that transmission here shortly. So there's primarily 2 types of connectors that hold on the splash guards. We have these small Phillips type right here, where you have to unscrew them and take off that little Phillips plastic screw. Just be gentle with it. Take that off. And then there's a retainer, and that retainer can be taken off with this little clip remover tool. Now you can use a little screwdriver as well, and so you just pop that out as well. And then finally, over here on the side, you can see that there are some hex-headed machine screws. So you can use a 7 millimeter socket, and I use a little driver just to pull them out. And so I just back them off like that and take them out. Now the thing to do here is to make sure that you do save these so you don't lose them. I have this nice little piston here that I kind of use to hold stuff. So just basically, need to go through and take off all of these different retainers and then gently remove them. Remember, there's going to be some corrosion on some of the metal ones, and you want to be gentle and not snap them off or anything like that and cause yourself a headache. So that's really the next step. So now with all the clips out, what we're going to do is just push this thing out of the way. You can also release this the emergency brake cable. It's hooked on with this little hook here. You just push it out of the way and essentially just grab it and move it. I'm just trying to do this with one hand here. Just move it so that it's pointing in a direction that's not going to be in your way, like that. So now that that's out of the way, we can get to the transmission over here. So we still have this splash guard that needs to be taken out. Same procedure. You got, looks like 3 of those little retainers that have the Phillips head, and just ease those out gently. When I did take this off, I noticed a lot of dirt behind it and stuff. Probably hasn't seen the light of day since when it was built back in '88. So good time, like I said, to clean it up and then put it back together. And so the next step is we're going to take this off and we'll have a good shot at the transmission. Okay, with the splash guards all out of the way, you can see I have all the parts here so that we can put it back together. Yeah, make sure you also have a jack stand, as you can see I do, because we're going to need to get under there in a bit. But now the transmission is totally exposed to us, and we can see the transmission cover. That's the valve body cover there. It has a number of bolts around it, and they're 13mm bolts. We're going to use kind of a long reach socket. We're going to get it in there and take those off. These are really accessible to us here, but on the top side it's going to take a little bit more effort to get to them. So let's take a look at that. As we go top side here, the first thing we should do, let me put this light down here so we can see, is to take off the intake from the air cleaner over to the engine. So it's got 3 flathead screws, 1, 2, 3, and there's a there's a hose ring on each one of them, and you just take that off and remove it, put it aside, and now you can look down into the transmission here, and you can see some of the other bolts that we're going to have to get to take that valve body cover off. Now that we're up here, we can actually see that connector that I mentioned. There's a connector back there. So if you're in a situation where the torque converter is causing your engine to stall and you don't know what to do and you're away from home, let this thing cool down, because it's some hot stuff in here. You might burn yourself, but you need to disconnect that, and when you do, the torque converter will no longer lock up on you. You lose a couple miles per gallon, big deal, if you're above 45 miles an hour, but if you're below 45, it wouldn't matter either way. But that would be the quick fix to get you home. So now the next step is to take those bolts off and then ease off the valve body cover there, and we're going to need to catch any transmission fluid that comes out when we do that. Okay, so that's our next step. As you can see, my helper is decided to take a little bit of a nap here, so I guess I'm on my own until she decides to wake up again. That's okay. So for these tight ones up top, I like to use this short 3/8 inch ratchet with the long 13mm socket. It goes right on pretty easily, as you can see, and you can just turn them off as they come into play here. And you can reach this thing in to some of those tight spots, like you see way down here. And that short reach ratchet does a really good job getting in there. If I can get this thing to hold on to so you can see it. There we go. So you can see the handle of the ratchet is right here. And so, just unbolt those. We've got one down there as well, and we're just going to take those off. So I've got most of them out, save for one. I think the most creative one is the one that's way back there. I'm going to turn on my light here so you can kind of see it. It's way back there, and I've got this double extension on my little DeWalt, and you can just get it on there just like that. And I don't know if you can see that real easy, but now that it's on there, I can just ease it out like this. And then, you know, you got to get kind of creative with these as you go through and get them done, because they vary in the time, in the distances and the obstructions that you have. So as you can see, I have this DeWalt here with the double extension and that 13mm socket. So now all of the bolts are out, and we're going to ease off the transmission cover. So just as a sanity check, I have the new gasket and I have all the bolts that I took out. So we have a total of 11 bolts. The reason I did that is to line up the bolts with the holes to make sure I didn't miss a bolt here or there. There is, you know, a couple of these bolts that are kind of not really in a good viewing spot, so this was just a sanity check to make sure I got them all. So the tools I needed finally to get all of this done, and I'll paraphrase this, you know, as well, you know, in the beginning. So we have a short reach 3/8 inch ratchet. I've got a long 3/8 extension. I've got just a regular smaller 3/8 extension, and I've got a wobble extension. I used a 13mm long socket and a 13mm short socket. You don't need all this stuff, but since I had it sitting around, it did make my life easier. And I did use the DeWalt impact driver to back out some of them that I could easily get to with that. Other than that, these things were hardly torqued in, and they didn't really need much torque to back them out. In fact, once I broke them loose, I just could take them off with my fingers. So now the next step is, of course, to ease off the cover. Alright, so with the bolts off, we're ready to ease off the cover. I have a couple of these Husky, I guess, pry bars, and I just gently put the pry bar in there and just kind of start to ease it off. As you can see, it's coming right off. And so we're just going to push that off, and voila, the transmission is exposed, and I can hear something leaking down here. So we've got some transmission fluid coming out, obviously. Not sure how much is going to come out, but I guess I got a big pan here. We'll catch it all. And now we're going to ease off that pan. So now you're getting a view of the transmission cover off. I did have to remove these two hoses that kind of wrapped around the transmission. You can back up and take a look at that. Once the bolts were out, the transmission cover was loose, but those two hoses kind of wrapped around the cover, and the cover wouldn't come off until I took the hose clamps off. So we got two hose clamps, one here and here. Use a 1/4 inch socket to turn off those hose clamps and back those hoses out. They do drip a little bit of transmission fluid, but that's it. So the pan actually goes down, right down through here, and I'll zoom out here in a second to take a look at that. But once I'm in here, you can see here's the 3rd gear pressure switch, and here's the TCC solenoid. And so we're going to be removing those and replacing them, and kind of reverse the process. So as I kind of zoom out here, you can see that the transmission cover, which is sitting right here right now, came down this way. So that's how it came out. So it came right down through between the frame and this cross member right here, the suspension. It just dropped through. And as you can see, there's very little transmission fluid that came out of this thing. I'd say there's not even a 1/4 cup in there that came out. So very little transmission fluid was lost here. So the next step is to remove the pressure switch and the TCC solenoid and replace it with what we have. Alright, so the next step is to get the TCC solenoid off. We've got a T30 hex bit on the socket, and that bolt that holds it on is right underneath here, and kind of using two hands to kind of ease that in there. I can see it. Having a little bit of difficulty with this light, but there we go. And we can just ease that off. It's pretty easy to get off. It's not torqued that much. You can actually take this off with all the transmission fluid. It's greased pretty well, and just kind of spin it off with your finger and the socket. And as we ease that off, by the way, the wires for that pressure switch just pop off. And she's almost there. There it is. Okay, so there's the T30 hex right there, and then the TCC solenoid pops right up right there. There it is. So it's off. You can see it's dripping transmission fluid. And now we just take the wiring harness off. We're going to then take off the pressure switch. So we're going to let that hang for a second. We're going to do that next. Alright, to remove the pressure switch, you can get a pair of channel locks or something, get it on there. It's also actually a 26 millimeter metric open-ended or box-ended wrench, and just put it right over that thing and just ease it off that way. So that's one way to do it. You can do it with a pair of channel locks as well. So it's just threaded up in there, and we can just ease that off this way. It's a couple turns and it should come out on its own here. So it's up to you. You don't have to have a specialized wrench like this, but there it is. It's just going to come off, and there it is right there. So we're going to replace that one as well. And so now we have our major components out. Alright, so we have the TCC solenoid actually removed. Here's the old one and here's the new one, just to show you some differences. You can see that the old one has this kind of raceway for the wires, and we're going to take that off and put it on the new one. They both have the same type of clip here. One's black, one's white, at about the same distance, so we're going to leave those alone. And this is an extra piece that's on this new one, so we're going to take that off when we put this little L piece back over here. Now, the trick to getting this off, the old one off, and I guess the new one back in the transmission. It's very difficult to film this because it's way up in there. This is up in that transmission housing right at the top, and really to get it off, there's this little barb. You can see that little barb there. So there's a little white retaining clip. You just push that up with one finger and then pull this out. There's some stuff in the way there, and so you have to just kind of ease it off. Don't yank it out or anything like that, but it does come out. So again, the retainer's on top. You just push that little clip up. It's a white clip, and then with another finger push this back, and it comes out, and it's not that bad. So that's how we're going to handle this thing. We're going to take this off, put it on the new one, and basically reverse the procedure to get the new TCC solenoid on. So now we're ready to put this all back together. We're going to reverse the process and put that pressure switch back in. And so that threads right up in here. And as I can kind of turn my light so you can see it a little bit better. And get that thing started, and then just turn it up in there. There it goes. A little slippery with all the transmission fluid here with these rubber gloves. So you don't want to over torque it. I'm just going to use my 26 millimeter and just make my life a little bit easier and just turn it with that a couple times here. Alright, I think that's good. Now we're ready to put the TCC solenoid in, and we'll route the wires and get that all going. So let's ease that in there. So it needs to go in like this, and then we need that T30 Torx. If I can get my hand over there and get that thing. There we go. Let's see if we can get that in there. Well, at least the bolts aren't rusted. Not in here anyway. Okay. Looks like we're almost there. That's as far as I can take it with my fingers, and the next step will be just to torque it down with the ratchet, and then we're going to route those wires up. Alright, now the TCC solenoid's in, and the third gear pressure switch is in as well. As you torque down on that T30 Torx bit, the solenoid actually snaps in, so it's flush now with the bottom of that transmission housing. And so the wires are routed up, and I'm going to see if I can zoom in on that connector. It's kind of hard to see behind that shifter cable assembly. And you can see the output side of that connector there. And so orienting that, it took about 5 minutes of just kind of easing that back and forth until it snapped in. So just be patient and get that in there. And then route the wires down as you saw before. And so now that this is together, the next step is to clean up the housing, get all the bits of the gasket off of this transmission housing on this side, and then of course the other side as well before we put it all back together. So with the bell housing part of it, these bits and pieces of the gasket are going to fall off, and you're just going to have to clean this thing off. I've got this little scraper. I'm just going to ease these off. I'm going to use some brake cleaner to degrease the inside of this thing and the outside before I put it back on to get it nice and pretty. But you definitely have to get all the little residuals of this old gasket off, because the new gasket could leak if you have any sort of anomalies on there. Alright, so the pan's now perfectly clean, got all the gasket material off. Use some of this brake cleaner to get all the greasy stuff off and clean the outside as well. So now with that all out of the way, here's the gasket, right? So it's going to sit on there like so. So what I'm going to do though is I am going to use a little bit of this tack compound and then lightly coat this gasket and then put it in the car first. And that little tack compound will keep that gasket in place. That way when I wrestle this bell housing back in there, the gasket will already be where it needs to be. This side of the gasket, as you can see, has kind of a, I don't know, it came from the factory that way. It looks like it's a little bit of a seal to it. And so the flat side of this gasket here is what is going to go against what's in the car right now. So that's why I thought I'd use a little bit of this to hold it in place so I'm not wrestling with two moving parts at once when I start to put all the bolts back. So really the rest of this is now to reverse the whole process. I did go ahead and clean off all the residual gasket material as well that's on the car side of the housing. Actually this here was much more difficult to get off than the stuff on the car. It just flaked off and was easy to clean. So that's the next step. So the gasket's in there with that tack compound. Notice that it's staying in place, and that's kind of a nice feature to have when you want to wrestle that housing back in. So that's going to be the next step. I'm just going to put it back in the way we took it out in reverse and get a couple bolts in loosely and then tighten it all up. Alright, so the housing's back in and all the bolts are in. They're snug, everything lined up good. And so the next step, of course, is to reconnect those hoses, get the shrouds back on the splash guards, and up on top here we'll replace the intake. And there were a number of the bolts that you can only get from up here. I had to stand in the trunk to do that, but no biggie, got them all back on. So just as a quick note, this is the amount of transmission fluid that came out. As you can see, it's really not a whole lot, maybe about 1/4 of a cup. So you're not going to have transmission fluid flowing out of this thing when it's all said and done. So that's where we're at, almost done here, and we'll call it good, see how things went. You woke up, huh? So to test the torque converter clutch, we notice we have the car up to temperature. We're going to accelerate and watch the RPMs. After it goes into third gear, there should be a slight dip in the RPMs. And there it is. Okay, so that means it's engaged. If I let it off the accelerator a little bit, and then step it down, RPM drop again just slightly, and that's the torque converter going back in and out upon acceleration and deceleration. So all in all, the job went well and everything seems to work fine, and the car does not stall when we come to a stop. Good luck, everyone.